Greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's video of a very unusual item. It's a windy day and I'm recording outside to take advantage of the light, so there'll be some noise in the background and I apologize for it. We'll go inside shortly. A guitar and amplifier shop in California contacted your old uncle and said they had a Gibson ga55V amp from the estate of Geils. Okay, now that got my attention. They said the amp itself worked perfectly, no problems, but that the cabinet had some damage and they wanted me to repair it. Now when they said some damage, I assumed, like you're probably assuming, oh, it's this terrible hole here on the floor. Well, no, it goes a little further than that. Okay, so let's take a look at exactly what's wrong with Geils ga55V cabinet. When you turn it over, it becomes evident that this thing was stored somewhere where termites were starving for Gibson cabinet wood. Okay, and I believe it was termites. Looking at this degree of damage, somebody has clear coated this heavily, probably trying to seal it, but as you can see, it's a mess. And also it's just paper thin in some areas. Okay, that kind of shocked me when I saw it because it's like miles beyond what I expected. Well, let's see, because the surprises continue. It appears that some of the gourmet termites decided they'd had enough here of floor wood and they wanted some side wood. Okay, of course, who doesn't? All right, so look here, not pretty, huh? Now it looks like the rest of the cabinet's not in bad shape. This covering's been torn off, but you know, the rest of it's not all that bad. But here's what they asked me to do, and that is replace the floor, replace as much of this side as necessary, and then recover it from about here down with some sort of material that vaguely resembles the original. Okay, I'll do my best to try to match it, but they haven't made material like that in a long time, so that's going to be a handful. They also want a back door made for this jewel. Okay, that apparently is missing. Maybe that got carried off by the termites back to their nest, okay, for Thanksgiving. But so it looks like we're going to have our hands full. Completely replaced floor, back door, and a good sized divot of the side, and then cover it so that it's not evident that there's been work done. Okay, so if that sounds like an interesting task, it is different. Let's face it, there's no amp here. There's not going to be any audio demo, but this might help you if you have encountered amplifier cabinets with a lot of damage. So it's a little change of pace, and if it sounds interesting, stay tuned because we're about to get started. Well, I think step one here ought to be removing the floor. And we're going to follow the physician's oath here, which is first, do no harm. This poor thing's in bad enough shape without me damaging it any worse. So what I'm going to do is make some cuts here in the floor and then try to extract the pieces of the floor. Now, I believe that this floor probably has like tongue and groove joints that go into the sides and back, which is going to complicate its safe and clean removal. But we're going to have to give it a try and see. So I'm going to go get a saw and start cutting kind of some radial cuts here so that I can isolate pieces of the floor and try and take them out individually. Well, so far so good. I made a couple cuts and the pieces are breaking out. They are kind of a tongue and groove arrangement here, so the bottom part here of the side is going to have to break away, and the new floor is just going to have to fit in with a different type of jointing. Okay, I'm going to continue the cutting and extraction. Okay, I've got another big piece out, and now there's just this final rectangle and this long strip up here at the top, and since that's the front of the cabinet, we have to be real careful not to destroy this sort of thin piece that's exposed here. Well, with the help of the good Lord and a big pair of channel locks, I got almost all of it out. There's a tiny little strip down here and some residue over here I'm going to have to chisel out, and I've got to get rid of these staples that held the cabinet together originally. This looks like tetanus for sure right here. Okay, let's go around the edge. You'll see I've extracted the floor very cleanly where I can cut a nice fresh piece of wood, and it should be able to fit in without any gaps. Now I think it's time to address this kind of pie-shaped divot here on the side. Well, by tapping and pushing down on the wood to see how solid it is, I ended up drawing a line to show where I think the decent solid cabinet wood exists. Now I'm going to use a handheld saber saw and cut this piece out, then check the edges to make sure that it's good solid wood, and then I'm going to cut out a piece of identical thickness good new wood and glue it in place. Okay, that termite eaten piece of side has been removed, and as you can see we have good solid cabinet wood all the way around. And since this wood mics out at exactly 3/4 of an inch thick, it's going to be easy to get a piece of lumber that I can cut to fill in the hole. Now I've C-clamped in a piece of 3/4 inch wood here and drawn the exact outline of the cutout with the black felt tip marker. Now I'm going to cut this piece out right here, and it should fit perfectly. Should meaning that it won't even come close. Okay, I peeled away that covering material all around here so I could see the actual wood surface so that I can make sure that my piece and it are at exactly the same level on the outside. And as you can see, the piece came out pretty close, enough that it's just held in there by interference. Now I'm going to glue it and clamp it, make sure it's perfectly flush, and pull it in with a pipe clamp this way so that it's in really snug. I'll leave it overnight, and then tomorrow we can worry about finishing the seam and leveling it and building the floor. One final step before gluing in the fresh piece here. I had to cut an inlet for the floor to fit in, just like on this side over here. So it's easier to cut it when the piece of wood's not glued in, trust me. Okay, so now it's time to glue and clamp this and leave it overnight. Now I've clamped a flat piece of plywood across the outer surface of the cabinet to establish its exact height. Then I've clamped the new piece in to match that height so that when I remove this outer piece of plywood, the joint here should be perfectly flush on the outside. Just for good measure, I think I'll run a pipe clamp across here and down there to pull the piece in tightly so that it fits snug all the way around. Okay, here's the pipe clamp in place, pushing that arced piece of wood deep into the inlet that I cut, and now I'm just going to set this aside and start cleaning up the mess. Let's take a look on the internet to see if we can find some substantiation of the claim that this amp was originally owned by Geils. We see here a Skinner auction of fine musical instruments, November 19, 2017, which is shortly after Geils died, and this is a auction of his estate. And here you see the exact cabinet that we just saw outside. Ga55V, it does have the vibrato. It's a 1958 model, sold for $1,476. And here we see under keywords Geils, Gibson, and music. Let's take a look here. I know that second 5 is missing on the one outside. Bottom left corner's a mess. Top left corner. It would appear that upper right and lower right, no, that lower right's worn through also. So it does appear that this amp was originally owned by Geils and was sold as part of an auction of his possessions, his estate, after he died in 2017. I guess this is one of those rare instances where something is exactly what we're told it is. Okay, unlike all the Supro Thunderbolts that were previously owned by Jimmy Page. And if there was any doubt about that particular Skinner's auction being of Jay Geils' estate property, this news story here pretty well puts that to rest. Okay, 100 or over 160 lots of musical equipment, memorabilia, and personal property. Okay, so there's no doubt about it. That was his amp, and I am indeed honored to be asked to work on it. Well, the glue is dried, and the seam is absolutely undetectable, so that when I cover this with the material, also I'm going to have to router a curvature here along this edge so that it can match the rest of the cabinet. I've got to do a little fiberglass work right here to bring this corner back into proper kind of square condition, but this repair should be undetectable, at least from the outside. Now it's time to buy a really nice piece of 3/4 inch plywood and fabricate the floor. Well, it's time to open the first of two heavy boxes from viewer and Patreon patron Bob Shively. Let's see what Bob sent us. Well, it looks like there is a sheet of, what's that, 3/8 inch plywood on top to protect the contents, and plywood all the way around. Boy, what a packing job. You could give lessons over there at UPS. Okay, we'll pull away the first layer of foam, and let me just set down the camera and get this stuff out, and we'll see what all is in here. Also, we see that Casey's come to join us to help us unpack. Sorry to interrupt your nap, Casey. Thank you for coming out here and joining us. Well, the first item is a big, fat, and beautiful Peerless Electrical Products output transformer with all the leads nicely marked. What a beaut. Let's set this down and keep digging. Second item is an equally impressive and husky, I'm going to guess a filter choke with two wires coming out the bottom. I'll have to do a search for these numbers. Okay, that's item number 2. Time to keep looking. Casey's wondering if there's any cat treats in here. We'll have to see, Casey. Be patient. And the third and final item is a Heathkit amplifier chassis with some tube sockets. It looks like there's capacitors inside through our power cord. This should be good as a basis for a build or as a parts contributor. Thanks, Robert, for thinking of us. The two really nice transformers and the chassis, and now let's go open box number 2. And here we have our second very heavy box from Bob Shively, ready to be opened. It looks like it's packed in the same way with the plywood protective covering on top. Let's see if I get that out of the way. Looks like there's a booklet over, I don't know what. Let me set down the camera and we'll unpack this and see. Lo and behold, it is the assembly manual for a Heathkit High Fidelity Amplifier model W-5M. Okay, and wow. All of the components and tubes, capacitors, transformers, everything to assemble the amp. Incredible. Let me get all this stuff out so we can get a good idea of what all there is. Looks like Casey approves of these boxes. She's rubbing her furry little cheeks on the corners. Okay, let me get back to unpacking this. Well, the box is finally empty, and packed inside was a heat shield, probably for that Heathkit chassis that we unloaded from the first box, and then a huge envelope full of Sprague atom capacitors, all sorts of non-polar caps, resistors, all sorts of components that are going to be really useful, and an assortment of radial capacitors. I don't really do work on printed circuit boards, but if I ever do, it looks like I'm in good shape capacitor-wise. Then one of the biggest heavy power transformers I've ever seen in my life, about 20 pounds worth, a toroid transformer. Look at this bag of tube shields and tube bases. And then Casey's back here guarding the Genelex Gold Lion tubes. These are KT66s. Okay, and should be very, very helpful. I guess you could build a push-pull amp and have one extra. Pick the best two that are best matched. What do you think, Casey? You're a little Gold Lion, aren't you? Huh? Good girl. Well, it looks like a fantastic haul here. I can't wait to open this bag and see what all's in there. It's like a pillowcase full of goodies. So thanks so much, Robert. We really appreciate you sending us these items, and I guarantee you they'll be put to good use. Well, I went shopping and found a really nice piece of 3/4 inch birch plywood. Okay, and I have drawn lines here that correspond, I believe, to the exact inside dimensions of the bottom of the cabinet. So let's go over to the trusty table saw, cut this out, and see how it fits. Well, one minor little trim right here on this side, and it fits inside the cabinet now, but it stands up a little high because I'm going to have to put inlets on both of these sides to allow it to settle down about another, say, 1/4 or 5/16 of an inch. Here's what I'm talking about. The original floor apparently was cut away right here at a bevel, so that the distance from here to the top was 3/4 of an inch. Okay, the plywood I have is not beveled that way, so I'm going to have to cut an inlet to compensate for this so that the plywood can settle down, so all 3/4 of an inch of it then is flush with the surface of the bottom. Okay, with this inlet cut right here to correspond to this part of the side, now I believe this is going to lay in completely flush with the bottom of the cabinet. Okay, it fits in very snugly, and as you can see, it is flush with the bottom of the cabinet. Now I'll have to do a little bit of sanding and all, because this surface here is a little uneven, but I think it's just going to be a perfect base panel for the cabinet. Okay, the floor is glued all the way around the perimeter, and the inside of the cabinet where it matches the floor is glued. Floor is put into place, put in a flush condition here with the base of the cabinet, and then using the trusty pneumatic nail gun, go all the way around the perimeter and be sure that the base here is anchored to the sides. Don't you just love these stickers that they put on with like some sort of industrial epoxy to permanently blemish a really nice piece of wood? It's going to take me longer to get the tag off than it did to make the bottom for the cabinet. Okay, but time to start scraping, I guess. Okay, I rounded off the corners of this new floor so that it would match the wear and tear of the cabinet. And as you can see, it fit in really well. There's no visible seam. May well fit better than the original did. Okay, so the floor is in place. Let's let the glue dry and get started on the rear panel. Now it's time to start on that upper rear panel. I was thinking it was 3/4 inch thick plywood, but it's not. It's 3/8 inch thick, as you can see from the lower panel. And since the chassis is going to be coming back right along this line, if you inset a thicker piece of wood, it would interfere with the chassis. So I've got to hunt up some 3/8 inch lumber like this. Well, I found a textured brown leatherette that I think matches pretty well with the cabinet material. So this will be what I'll cover the back panel with, and that upper side where the brown is missing. Okay, let's take a look here at the right side of the amp cabinet as you're looking at it from the front. And you'll see that the brown leatherette here is missing. So I'm going to put in a piece here. Then I'm going to cut the vent holes in the rear panel and cover it with the same material. Now my method, which I've shown in several previous videos, is to first coat the wood with a fairly thick layer of the Weldwood original contact cement. This has the volatile solvent. Okay, then we wait for it to dry to where it's just barely tacky to the touch. Now you can see how it is dulled down now that it is dry, and it is slightly tacky to the touch. These areas where it's still a little shiny, it's going to be stickier than the other areas, but be sure you don't have any totally flat areas where the porous wood has soaked in all of the glue, because then you'll have a little bubble in your vinyl. Okay, I think this is probably going to be about right. So now it's time to spray with an aerosol contact cement the back of the material that I'm going to be using to cover this area. Then carefully lay the material down where you want it. Be sure it's exactly where you want it, because it's not easy to remove it after you've let the two surfaces stick. Then take your linoleum roller and go over every square inch of it. Make sure that it's really secure to the surface. And there you have it. Now the brown leather wraps around here and is going to blend into that rear cover that we have to create the vent holes in. Here is the panel. I've cut it to be just the right size, and now there's vents that I'll have to put in it here that are for the tubes to get a little circulation. I've been considering all sorts of possibilities on how to cover this portion of the cabinet right here. Okay, it's on the side, it's very visible from the front, and it's really, this isn't honest wear. Okay, this is a result of in storage. The termites got to it. It's sort of like those guitars in Nashville where the river flooded. This isn't part of normal wear and tear. And rather than just buy a piece of material that's sort of like this and tacking it on here and it's just going to be a real obvious repair, I've been thinking that maybe the best bet would be to remove the material from this rear panel down here, okay, and use it to cover the side, and then cover this rear panel with that same dark brown leather so that it goes along with the upper panel that's going to be covered in the leather. Okay, I realize it's not completely original, but I think I'll be using original materials where it shows and using something that's going to look really nice on the back of the cabinet that is rarely seen. Okay, it's a compromise, but it's the best I can do. I hope you agree. Okay, this is the side that had the brown leather torn off and had all the termite damage. Using the strip of material from that lower rear panel, I was able to cover this so that it looks exactly like it did originally. Okay, it's original material, and I think looks a whole lot better than I really ever hoped. Now I'm going to cover this with the brown leather and then start making this upper rear panel. I had no idea what the rear panel of a ga55V cabinet looked like, but I was able to find this photograph on the internet to help me in my fabrication. Using the photograph I found on the internet of the rear of the GA55 cabinet, I've taken measurements of the back door and figured out a scale in which to reproduce the vented rear panel here with exact proportions as it should be. Okay, I've drawn to scale the cutouts here for the vents for the tubes, and I'm going to use my hole cutter set here chucked up here in the drill press to cut out these holes at either end of the vents, and then I'm going to use the saber saw to cut between the holes. Well, the 1.5 inch holes are cut into the back panel, and now it's time to get out the saber saw and cut along the bottom and top lines to make them into tube vents. Well, the vent holes are now completely cut out. Now it's time to get the router table and router a rounded edge on the outside of the rear door around the vents, and then we'll be ready to cover them with that leatherette. Now the vent holes have been routed, and it's time to cover this surface with that leatherette. The vent holes now have been smoothly routed, and it's time to cover this rear panel with that brown leatherette material. One nice touch is to paint this inner curvature at the ends of the vent holes. You'll see why in just a few minutes. Paint them a color that matches the material you're going to be using. Well, the outside surface of the material is very tightly attached now to the panel, and I wrapped around, and where the corners overlapped I just ran with a razor blade and then removed the two little triangles so that the corners then lined up with no overlapping. And now it's time to cut out these vent holes. I'm going to first coat around this surface with the contact cement, and then we're going to cut like some radial cuts in here and then fold the pieces over and let them adhere to the inside of the panel surface. Okay, I made like Y slits on either end, and then just rolled the material over and pressed it down firmly with the linoleum roller. And now from the front or the outside, you can see just how nice it looks. Okay, it looks very much like the one in the picture, I hope. And I'll show you the advantage of painting in that curvature. You see that where there's a V-shaped cut there's like a divot out of the material. The brown makes it almost invisible, whereas if it were bright white pine wood shining out at you, it wouldn't be good at all. Okay, so that's the back door. It's time to drill and install it, and then we're done. And here's the rear of the cabinet with that upper panel installed. I honestly think it looks better to have it match the lower panel instead of having the lower panel be that weird kind of Berber carpet material. But that's it. What I'll do in a second, I'm going to set it down and do a quick walk around, and then I believe we're finished. Now this is exactly the same angle as the photo used in the auction ad. This is the undamaged side and front, all of the corners, everything, the missing 5, everything is exactly as it was in the auction ad photo. Now I have a feeling this is exactly the way the amp looked when Geils owned it. Okay, all I've done is to eliminate all of the terrible termite damage that was done to the floor and to the side over here. I've put it back into the condition it was when he owned it and used it. Now for the bottom of the cabinet, instead of covering over with some material that someone might think was just concealing the termite destruction, I left the wood bare and stained and antiqued it so that it has a really nice old 1960s look, and I installed some new rubber feet. Here is a view we've already seen with the termite damaged portion here repaired and recovered with material borrowed from the lower rear panel. Here's that upper rear panel that was made to be a scaled replica of the original and recovered in material similar to that I used to cover the missing area up here on the damaged side. Well, I guess that concludes this video on the restoration of the Gibson 55V cabinet of Geils' original amplifier. I hope you enjoyed it, that parts of it were instructive and helpful if you plan on doing similar cabinet work yourself. As usual, I would like to thank all my Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors for keeping us on the air and advertising free. If you would like to join them, I will include links in the video description to help you to do so. In conclusion, I'd like to make just a couple comments. Number one, be very careful when you're buying items sight unseen from auctions or sellers, especially when there's only one photograph to judge. If this had been bought on eBay, you would have recourse. You could always come back and say that the damage was not disclosed and get either a partial or full refund. I think it's a sad commentary on commerce in general when one of the fundamental rules is let the buyer beware. I think a far better rule would be disclose all the good and bad aspects of the item to the buyer and then let them make the proper informed decision. On that happy note, it's time to discuss our part 2 video, which in this case is going to be fairly short, and the result of a concern I had on that 1930 Ford coupe that was featured in the last video, part 2, where I put on the 3 two-barrel carburetors. The body was just bare, exposed, rusty metal, and although that looks neat, okay, it has a real rustic sort of patina, as they say. I always thought patina was just an excuse for a bad finish, but it concerned me because we had rainy weather and I don't want additional rust or harm. I kind of like it to stay the way it is. So I took the time and effort to find a material. It's a spar urethane in a satin finish that has very high ultraviolet resistance. And I coated the entire body with this material. Now I'm going to show you how it looks. It has sort of a little bit of a glow. It sort of darkened the rusty areas, but it really looks, I think, a lot better, a lot classier. And also now, if I pour water on the car, it runs off like off of a duck's back. Okay, so I really think it's a win-win situation, both for looks and durability. So let's do a little walk around here on the 30 Ford and see what you think. Okay, I've rolled the car out into what we have left of sunshine here. It's getting kind of late in the day. I think you can see now the pattern of rust and old paint and everything still through this satin finish that I've applied. This completely seals it. Okay, before the rust was actually dusty. If you rubbed the car, it would all come off on your fingers. And on the tarp, it just wasn't a very stable surface. And when you sunk a few bucks into a car, you hate to have it just disappear in the driveway. Okay, turn into red dust. But don't you get a kick out of the look? It has kind of a nice, kind of almost a leathery sheen to it, which I think looks a lot classier and more finished. Not like some old rusting hulk sitting out somewhere in a field. But anyway, I hope you like it. It took 3 or 4 days to do. It's also inside the door jambs and every other place where there's exposed metal. Okay, so I thought you'd get a kick out of it. Also, for those viewers who questioned my routing of the vacuum advance line to the manifold itself rather than above the throttle plate, please check a reference that I'm going to put in the video description that goes into great detail about why this is by far the better way to gain vacuum for your advance rather than above the throttle plate, as is actually more conventional nowadays. Okay, I think you'll get a kick out of it. I know I did. Okay, so that's the car as it stands, and I hope you enjoy it.